Picture this: a kid comes home from school, drops a VHS tape into a brand new VCR, pops popcorn in a microwave that still feels like science fiction to the grown-ups in the house, and settles onto a couch surrounded by walls painted the color of a Miami sunset. That single afternoon, that one ordinary moment, holds almost everything that made the 1980s the most vividly remembered decade in American memory. It was loud, it was neon, it was anxious and optimistic all at once, and it changed the texture of everyday life more than almost any decade before it. So let's step back into it, one room, one radio station, one shopping mall at a time. We'll start right where that kid was standing, in the living room, because home life in the 80s looked and felt different from anything that came before. If the 70s had been all about earth tones, deep browns, burnt oranges, avocado greens, the 80s threw the whole palette out the window. Suddenly walls were mauve. Countertops were peach. Trim was teal. And a lot of the credit, or blame, depending who you ask, goes to a television show about two Miami detectives in pastel blazers. Miami Vice didn't just influence fashion, it redecorated America's living rooms, turning pastel from a beach house novelty into a mainstream design choice found in suburban homes from California to Connecticut. But it wasn't just the colors on the walls that were changing, it was what those walls contained. For decades, American television had meant 3 networks and maybe a local UHF station if you were lucky enough to catch the signal. Cable television changed that arithmetic entirely, suddenly offering dozens of channels, and with it came something radically new: channels built around a single genre, all news, all sports, all music, all the time. Families who once gathered around a set schedule dictated by 3 networks now had choices, and those choices multiplied by the year. And then there was the VCR, maybe the single most transformative piece of technology to enter the American home that decade. Movie night stopped being an event that required a trip to a theater and became something you could do on a random Tuesday, thanks in large part to a new kind of storefront popping up in strip malls across the country, Blockbuster Video, with its blue and yellow logo and rows of VHS tapes waiting to be rented for a couple of nights. Renting a movie became a ritual unto itself, walking the aisles, debating between a new release and an old favorite, maybe grabbing a box of candy on the way to the register. The kitchen was transforming too. Microwave ovens went from a novelty appliance to a fixture on the counter, promising dinner in minutes instead of hours, and an entire industry of frozen and microwavable food sprang up to meet that promise. Meanwhile, out in the hallway, the phone finally broke free of its cord. Cordless phones meant you could wander the house, out onto the porch, into the backyard, still tethered to a conversation but no longer tethered to a wall. It sounds small now, but at the time it felt like a small miracle of convenience. And tucked into a corner of the den or perched on a desk in a spare bedroom, something even bigger was quietly beginning: the personal computer. Machines like the Apple II and the Commodore 64 started showing up not just in offices but in homes and classrooms, blinking cursors in simple green or amber text inviting a new generation to learn programming, play early games, and get comfortable with a machine that, within a decade or two, would become inseparable from daily life. Nobody quite knew yet what these beige boxes would become, but the seeds were being planted right there on the family desk. Of course, none of this technological transformation happened in a political vacuum. The decade opened with the election of Ronald Reagan, whose presidency set a tone that would come to define the era: an unapologetic optimism, a sense that better days were not just possible but already arriving. His re-election campaign in 1984 famously leaned into that feeling with the phrase "morning in America," and for a lot of households, that's genuinely how it felt: a fresh, sunlit start after the economic malaise of the previous decade. That optimism came wrapped in real economic growth, and out of that growth came a new kind of American archetype, the Yuppie, short for young urban professional. These were 20 and 30-somethings climbing corporate ladders, carrying briefcases, driving nice cars, and unapologetically chasing wealth and status in a way that felt distinctly of its moment. Ambition wasn't something to hide anymore, it was something to display, on your wrist, in your closet, in the car parked in your driveway. But underneath that shiny economic surface, an older, colder anxiety still lingered. The Cold War had been part of American life for decades by this point, and through much of the 80s, the fear of nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union remained a real and present undercurrent, showing up in school drills, in movies, in the collective imagination of an entire generation raised to understand that the world could, in theory, end at any moment. That fear didn't disappear overnight, but it did begin to thaw as the decade wore on. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in the Soviet Union, he introduced two words that would reshape global politics: glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. Those reforms set off a chain of events that, by the very end of the decade, culminated in the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, a moment so unexpected and so monumental that it felt like watching history physically crumble in real time on live television. While all of that was unfolding in boardrooms and summit meetings, something equally revolutionary was happening on the airwaves, or more precisely, on a brand new channel that launched in 1981 with a simple declaration: video killed the radio star. MTV didn't just play music, it fundamentally changed how music was consumed, turning songs into visual experiences and turning musicians into round-the-clock celebrities. Michael Jackson's videos became cultural events in their own right. Madonna built an entire persona around reinvention, image, and provocation. Prince blurred every genre line he could find. And these weren't just musicians anymore, they were visual megastars, their faces as recognizable as their voices. The music itself was just as varied as the decade demanded. Synthpop brought glossy, electronic sounds into the mainstream. Hair metal brought big guitars and even bigger hair. And bubbling up from block parties and underground clubs, hip-hop was beginning its rise toward becoming one of the most influential genres in American music history. And if you wanted to take all of that music with you, there was one device that made it possible: the Sony Walkman, a simple cassette player that let people, for the first time, curate their own private soundtrack anywhere they went, on the bus, on a jog, walking through the mall. And speaking of the mall, that's really where so much of 80s teenage life actually happened. The shopping mall wasn't just a place to buy things, it was the social hub, the place you went to see and be seen. Food courts brought a dozen fast food options under one roof. Record stores let you flip through albums for hours without buying a thing. And video game arcades, glowing with neon and filled with the electronic symphony of dozens of games running at once, gave teenagers a place to spend their allowance and their afternoons in equal measure. Movies were having a golden moment too. E.T. the Extraterrestrial turned a story about a stranded alien and a lonely kid into a cultural phenomenon. Back to the Future combined science fiction with genuine heart and became an instant classic. And writer-director John Hughes carved out an entire subgenre of his own, teen films like The Breakfast Club that treated adolescent angst and identity with a seriousness that hadn't really been given to teenagers on screen before. Going to the movies wasn't just entertainment, it was a shared cultural experience that gave people something to talk about at school or work the next day. And in 1985, home entertainment took its own giant leap forward with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System. After a video game industry crash had left a lot of people wondering if home gaming was even a viable business anymore, Nintendo's little gray box, with a plumber named Mario at the helm, single-handedly revived the industry and planted a controller in the hands of an entire generation of American kids. Now, if you want to picture what all these people actually looked like walking through those malls and dancing to those MTV videos, imagine excess, because that's really the word that defines 80s fashion. Shoulder pads made blazers look like armor. Neon colors, hot pink, electric blue, lime green, showed up on everything from windbreakers to leg warmers. Big hair wasn't just a look, it was an engineering project, held aloft by what felt like an entire can of hairspray. Acid-wash denim gave jeans and jackets a strange, cloud-like texture. And perched on top of it all, a pair of Ray-Ban Wayfarers, the same sunglasses made famous by movies and music videos alike, completed the look. Food culture was having its own kind of excess. Fast food chains expanded aggressively, planting drive-thrus on seemingly every corner. Microwavable snacks multiplied to match the new microwave sitting in every kitchen. And in 1985, one of the most infamous marketing blunders in American corporate history unfolded when Coca-Cola decided to change its century-old formula, launching what became known as New Coke. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Loyal customers felt like something sacred had been taken from them, and within just a few months, the original formula was brought back as Coca-Cola Classic, a lesson in brand loyalty that business schools still teach today. But for all the neon and nostalgia, it would be incomplete, even dishonest, to remember the 80s as only a decade of big hair and bigger optimism. Underneath the surface, the country was also grappling with real and painful challenges. The AIDS crisis emerged as one of the most devastating public health emergencies in American history, met initially with confusion, fear, and in many cases, government inaction, leaving a generation to organize, grieve, and fight for basic recognition and care. The war on drugs escalated dramatically throughout the decade, reshaping law enforcement priorities and the criminal justice system in ways that would ripple for decades afterward. And while Wall Street and the yuppie class were thriving, entire regions of the country were struggling. The Rust Belt, once the beating industrial heart of America, watched factories close and jobs disappear as manufacturing shifted overseas. Rural farming communities faced their own quiet crisis, with falling crop prices and mounting debt pushing family farms that had stood for generations toward foreclosure. That's really the honest picture of the 1980s, a decade that can't be reduced to just one thing. It was mauve walls and Cold War tension. It was Madonna on MTV and factory towns going quiet. It was Nintendo consoles under Christmas trees and families quietly struggling to make ends meet. It was a decade of contradictions, dazzling on the surface, complicated underneath, and endlessly memorable. And maybe that's exactly why, all these decades later, we still can't stop looking back at it.